Wyandot, or Wendat, were northern Iroquois from the Huron Confederacy and their allies captured during the fall of Huronia. Joseph Brant Jr. once told a historian that his paternal grandfather had been an Onondaga chief. Thus, in the century between 1650 and 1750, the Brant family went from being slaves of the Onondaga, entering the highest levels of the matriarchy that governed the Haudenosaunee clan system, which is how Joseph Brant Sr. came to lead the Five Nations during the Revolutionary War, because his older sister Molly, Sir William Johnson's consort, was powerful among the Haudenosaunee elders. Molly Brant is also honored on April 16th of every year by the Anglican Church of Canada. She died in Kingston in 1796. Joseph Brant freed the last of his slaves through his will after he died in 1807. Sophia Berthen Pooley, a child of slave parents stolen by her own relatives and sold to Brant, is one of the best-known slaves of the Loyalist period. She later told Benjamin Drew, a collector of slave narratives in Ontario in the early 1850s, that I guess I was the first colored girl brought into Canada. There were hardly any white people then, nothing here but Indians and wild beasts. Pooley lived with the Brant family at the head of Lake Ontario, in what is now Burlington. In 1798, Brant was given nearly 3,500 acres near the sand spit that divides Lake Ontario from Burlington Bay. Most of that land he then sold to his Loyalist allies. That's the territory at the end of Lake Ontario there on the map. We will return to Burlington, the Brants, slaves, and free blacks at the head of Lake shortly. But first I want to go back to the Quakers, many of whom had followed the Loyalists into Upper Canada, though they themselves were not regarded by Simcoe as Loyalists because their peace testimony ensured that most of them had not fought for the British against the American rebels. Significantly for this subject, large numbers of Quakers made their homes near the Niagara River, Bertie Township, which is where the Fort Erie is. It was known as the Quaker Township. Bertie sits at the Lake Erie source of the Niagara River across from Buffalo, an area once known as the Crossing. It was across which a great many fugitive slaves made their way to freedom in Upper Canada by rowboat, canoe, ferry, or on winter ice carts from Loyalist time to the end of slavery. There's an American Quaker historian named Christopher Densmore who published a journal article called Migrating Quakers, Fugitive Slaves, and Indians, the Quaker Ties of New York and Upper Canada. This is quoting him. What is clear to me is that Quakers functioned as cultural mediators among the Iroquois. They were Euro-Americans, but clearly distinct from other Euro-Americans, perceived by the Iroquois as being well-intentioned toward the Indians, and thus useful as a source of information about Euro-American behavior. They also taught by example that it was possible to dissent from the broader culture. Quakers provided an ethical basis for minority group survival. The Iroquois could, like the Quakers, be selective in their choices. Densmore also observes that the Quakers were considered by American slavers to be in league with both the British and the tribes in a conspiracy against the economic interests of slavery. Densmore writes, the Quakers as allies of the British is the theme of a very curious piece of documentation I encountered while working on this paper. The document is a print, first published during the War of 1812, then reissued in New York during the Canada Rebellion. The title is British Warfare in 1812, 1837, and 38. On the left side of the print is a British soldier offering rum to an Indian in return for scalps. On the right, a British salt officer encourages a slave to set fire to a building. In the center of the print is the figure of a Quaker inciting a slave to arson by means of a document labeled Liberty for Negroes. Densmore concluded his article by noting that we know a little bit about Quakers in New York and Upper Canada, and a little bit about Quakers in abolition, and a little bit about Quakers and Indians, but we did not fully understand all the connections or the implications of those connections. There is much work to be done. One of the aims of my books was to add to the work of Densmore. Exodus and Arrival in particular goes to great lengths to trace the links of American anti-slavery activists among the Society of Friends on both sides of the border and in the areas like Burton Township, leading away from the Niagara border, all the way north to what was called the Queens Bush Settlement, where 1,500 former African Americans squatted on Anglican clergy reserves in northwest Wellington County and northeast Waterloo County from the 1830s to the 1860s. That's the area up on the map. Just there's a line going up straight there, the Jones baseline. Near the top of that, it's all to the left of that. On the website for the Brantford branch of the United Empire Loyalists is an account headlined "Remembering African American Canadian Settlement in Brantford." It states that according to local oral history, it was the Tuscarora Baptists who guided the fugitive slaves up the Grand River from Buffalo and Niagara Falls. To understand the importance of that statement, it needs to be placed against the second fact. In the book, Early Days in Brantford, J.J. Hawkins notes, Mohawks were 20 years, i.e. 1783 to 1803, settled upon their land along the Grand River when the first white set traders came amongst them. Mohawk village was the chief seat, and being near the main highway from east to west, gave the first start to the village of Brant's Ford, surveyed in 1830. The surveyed lots were then sold to English, Irish, and Scots, Native Canadians, United Empire Loyalists, and Americans. There was also a large inflow of escaped slaves from the United States who fraternized with the Indians, and the village became a very turbulent and disorderly place. Whites petitioned the government to send the blacks to the Queen's Bush. It should be stated here that the Queen's Bush was part of the Huron Tract and was Crown land ceded by the Saugeen Ojibwe by treaty. The settlement of former slaves was in the southeast corner of what was a large clergy reserve, i.e. it was held by the Crown to be sold for the benefit of the Church of England, which was at that time the state church of Upper Canada. Despite Hawkins' claim that whites petitioned the government to relocate the former slaves to Queens Bush, I have found no evidence of a white petition of that description. However, there was in 1828 a petition of 200 Upper Canadian free blacks and former slaves who petitioned for land grants in the bush. However, since the lands were slated for sale, they could not be granted, so the petition was turned down. Almost immediately after, the squatters began to arrive. Leaving most of that story aside for now, what matters at the moment is that one of the central figures who signed that petition was a man named John Von Patten, whose father, Prince, had been a slave of Joseph Brant's until the old chief's death in 1807. John Van Patten had therefore been raised among the Six Nations of both the Grand River and among Brant's family and allies at the head of the lake, including other loyalist blacks. Returning to the claim of the Brantford UEL website, in 1842, there was a petition of Tuscarora Baptists to the new Lieutenant Governor, Charles Bagot, requesting help in a conflict the petitioners were having with the Anglican Tuscarora, who were upset at the Baptists for leaving the Church of England earlier that year. I have since discovered that the Grand River Tuscarora had only been Baptist from the beginning of 1842, so the loyalist history of Brantford on the site is probably a historical conflation, which is to say, there would have been the individuals later associated with the Baptists who matter most in the equation, i.e. people who were known in the later history of Brantford as Baptists, but it would have been Anglican beforehand. And as the history of those individuals show, they had also been Methodists before they were Baptists, since the Methodists arrived on the reserve in the late 1820s. Before we get to those individuals, it should be noted that the bed of the Underground Railroad, as alluded to in my title, Laying the Bed, the native origins of the Underground Railroad, was the native trail system. Highland routes out of the American South, Appalachian trade routes used by First Nations for thousands of years, routes that the Quakers and others used as access points to help fugitive slaves already using them. First Nations were the only people who knew the trails, beyond a few mountain men, so the Quaker system was in part designed to help slaves get up and down from the trails where no bounty hunters dared to go. If you didn't know where the trails led, you ended up lost forever. The Tuscarora are originally from North Carolina. They themselves had been enslaved by whites after the Virginian settlers crossed into their territory in the 1700s, after which hundreds ended up on plantations in the Caribbean. The surviving Tuscarora hid in the Great Dismal Swamp, where fugitive African slaves were also hiding out. Eventually, the Tuscarora was sold off to the blacks, moved north of the Highland Trails and into Seneca territory via the Allegheny Mountains into upper New York State when it was still a colony. The Seneca adopted the Tuscarora, and thus the Five Nations of the French-English War period became the Six Nations. A portion of the Tuscarora, to this day, remain in Seneca territory, while the rest joined Grant's Loyalist Confederacy of Tribes and moved on to the Grand River. Christopher Densmore identifies the Seneca of the Cattaraugus Reserve, southwest of Buffalo, as being allies of both Quakers and fugitive slaves, a subject explored in my second book, Exodus and Arrival. The Tuscarora Reserve on the American side of the Niagara River is located above the whirlpool. The female elders of the Six Nations were the ones who made the decision for some of the clans to remain south of the border, for some to go into other Canada. The individuals I have identified as both African American and Tuscarora are all members of one family, and it is the story of discovering them and their connections to the Grand River, the head of the lake, Guelph, and the Queens Bush settlement that forms the shape of laying the bed. The starting point was a man named Michael Grote, who I came to call Mike Sr., because he was the first of several Michael Grotes to appear in the narrative. Mike Sr. was one of the signees of a 1794 petition of free Negroes who unsuccessfully sought land together in the colony. For extensive genealogical research, I came into contact with Grote family members trying to trace their ancestors. The descendants had already associated Mike Sr. with a North Carolina Loyalist white family, the Davis Gents, who played an important role in life at the head of the lake, and with whom the Grotes continued to remain involved. One of the great Gents was also the first known non-native person to live in what became the Queens Bush settlement, before the land had been ceded to the government by the Saugeen Ojibwe in the late 1820s. Having failed to receive a land grant, Mike Sr. ended up buying land in the Burlington area through the agency of Augustus Jones. Augustus Jones was a Welsh surveyor responsible for the creation of the Jones baseline, the line on which all townships north of the lake to the future village of Arthur was based. For a time, he also had two wives, one Mohawk and one Mississauga. Augustus was also the father of Reverend Chief Peter Jones, son of a daughter of a Mississauga chief. Peter became a Methodist minister and did more to save his mother's people from disappearing as a people than anyone. We will come back to Reverend Jones. Surveyor Jones was Joseph Brandt's land agent and lived in what is now Upper Stony Creek, where the Davis Gents first settled before some crossed to live on lands bought from Brandt. Mike Sr. bought land in the last year of the old chief's life. John Brandt, son of the old chief, lived at the head of the lake after the death of his father, although the property was passed down maternal lines from Joseph's last wife, Catherine, to her daughter, Elizabeth Brandt Carr, whose husband was himself a grandson of Sir William Johnson by Johnson's white wife. The Groves became the core of a black community in what was at first Nelson Township. They served on the Dundas Road Patrol with Loyalist whites during the War of 1812, when events across the bay at Stony Creek and the naval battles around Burlington Bay were in full bore. Mike Sr. even had a large contingent of First Nations warriors encamped on his property in the fall and winter of 1813 and 14. Simon Grote, who later lived on near William Gent and Queens Bush, served in the Colored Corps. In 1814, another son of Mike Sr.'s, William, and a North Carolina Tuscarora named Margaret, had a son named Abraham. In the above discussed 1842 petition of Tuscarora Baptist, William Grote Jr., and a half-brother named Isaac Whitby are all listed as Tuscarora warriors. In later census records, they are identified as colored Negro, a catch-all phrase for pure, mixed, and pure-race Africans and other non-whites. There was a man named John Grote, later identified by his son Henry as a mulatto, i.e. mixed race, who married a Mississauga woman and lived with her and her children on the Credit River with the tribe before Reverend Jones took his congregation to live among the Mohawk on the Grand River. In 1833, Jones baptized two of the Grote children on the Grand. For some reason, they took the last name Grote Mike and then shortened it up to Mike. One of Mike Sr.'s daughters, Margaret, married an American-born black named Abram Top in Nelson. Together, they moved west of the Grand into Norwich Township, where their son Abram Top Jr. became a Quaker. Their granddaughter Hannah married an escaped slave, an African Methodist Episcopal minister named Anderson, who ran the A&E Church in Otterville. Norwich was an active Quaker anti-slavery community with family links to the Rochester Anti-Slavery Society for a man named Lindley Moore, who had also founded an anti-slavery society in Sparta, just down the road from Otterville, before moving to Rochester, home of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, whose February birthday is one of the two reasons why Black History Month is celebrated in February. Our research